back. Now, in recent weeks, we've seen a growing number of nations and world leaders looking to trade in their own currencies outside the US dollar. Now, Busi Mabuza is the chair of the BRICS Business Council and says that the alliance is now mulling over the idea of trading with a more common currency and that those discussions will be held outside the BRICS summit, which will be hosted by South Africa later this year. Well, let's get into that whole discussion around the de-dollarization of economies globally. We're now joined by Remi Piet. He's a senior partner at Embellie Advisory. Great to have you with us on the show today, Mr. Piet. Now, I'd like to first get your sense of whether there's a clear plan amongst the BRICS nations to create this new currency. Do we know who is going to drive this movement? How close is the plan to becoming a reality? Is it realistic? What is your take on all those?
Well, thank you, Yusha, for the invitation. And yes, very good question from you. There is a clear attempt at trying to set up a currency, especially a reserve currency here. Whether the contours of that specific plans are not very clear, they should be addressed, especially in August at the summit in South Africa. There are clear interests from all the members of the BRICS for different reasons to move forward on that plan. Whether there are economic interests or geopolitical reasons that motivate this, you do have on one side China that is interested in forging stronger alliances with a series of countries and therefore challenge the American supremacy on the world economy. You do have the interest from Russia, especially to try to avoid sanctions and try to have more free capacities of trading by making sure that it moves away from the capacity from the Americans to actually enforce sanctions or actually move towards a series of lawsuits when you're using the US dollars as the extraterritoriality of the American system that allows the US court system to actually charge companies that would use the US dollar, so using a different currency would actually protect the Russian companies from some of the sanctions. And you also have a very important economic factors to this that is being pushed much more by Brazil, India, and South Africa in terms of being able to make sure that there's more stability to their own currency. We've seen over the last few weeks and months different movements from the American Federal Reserve, especially hiking its interest rate. That has had a very strong impact on the currencies of developing and emerging nations that have seen that their own currency decrease in terms of value because investors were favoring the US to put their money in because of the higher interest rate in the US. And this movement towards forging a new currency between the BRICS is kind of following also some of the additional attempt from Brazil, especially with Argentina, of labeling their trade between Argentina and Brazil in a single currency that would be outside of the US dollar system. So all these different attempts that are motivating, as I was saying, by geopolitical, security, and economic reasons have created the momentum towards potentially building a new reserve currency. The contours of that currency and whether it really is going to have an impact are still to be defined. Right. And that will be seen in August in South Africa.
And it is interesting you say that because chatting with an analyst last week, he actually said that it's not that simple when we talk about de-dollarization and finding another currency. He said we need to find something stable to peg, for example, commodities to. So in light of that, on the other hand, like you said, the talk around de-dollarization is now growing stronger. Does it signal that we could see this de-dollarization gaining momentum and becoming a reality anytime soon? What's your take on that?
So on the first part of your question, you're absolutely right. It's very important to be able to find some commodities to peg it on. And in that element, when you're looking at the presence in those countries of large oil producers such as Russia, Saudi Arabia has also mentioned interest in the future of potentially joining that movement. When you look at producers of gold and other commodities, copper and others, such as Brazil or South Africa, that provides the kind of capacities and collateral to peg the currency into. But indeed, also it's a question of trust and a question of whether other investors will favor that specific currency. We've seen this also in the past with the emergence of the euro as another currency, which is a much more ambitious scheme here. It's a attempt at converging economies into a single currency in Europe. In the case of the BRICS currency, we're looking at very different types of economy in size. First of all, China represents roughly 74% of the overall BRICS, but also of the structure of the economies themselves that are very different from one to another. And that's where, even when I was mentioning there's a momentum, there's joint interest towards moving forward, those interests are slightly different, and that's where you can see potentially some obstacle upon the road to be able to have this objective happening and implemented in the near future.
Now, looking forward, I've heard many theories out there. Of course, they say we have to pay attention to the destabilizing effects of the dollar's dominance on monetary policy and, of course, the overall economy as well. I heard Nouriel Rubini talk about how India's rupee could become the next currency to peg our reserves to. Do you think that there's strong arguments for de-dollarization today? What are the strongest arguments?
Well, there are arguments, as I was mentioning, in terms of wanting to be more independent in terms of conducting economic policy, evading sanctions, and again, those might be bad reasons in the case of Russia specifically. But in a case of being able to move forward and facilitate the de-dollarization, there's actually other ways that have been maybe more efficient in terms of limiting that disrupting factors of the US dollars and positions that might be taken in Washington in terms of interest rate, for example. So, for example, there could have been a simpler approach, such as more consultation between different federal banks, so that a decision from the American Fed that doesn't impact so strongly other economies, if it's more kind of working in collaboration, as we've seen during 2007, 2008 financial crisis, for example. Here you've seen kind of unilateral decisions in Washington that have strongly impacted other economies and provide kind of incentives for this movement towards de-dollarization. But the capacities of making this happen is still in question. The technicalities and objectives, as I was mentioning, are very different from one country to the next. And maybe a simpler way is more to have more consultation between Federal Reserve banks and having a more let's say balanced panel of currencies in terms of exchanges. Now, you still have interest in having a common currency for reserves and for trades, especially between countries such as I was mentioning, Brazil and Argentina, that try to have this approach being more independent from volatility in US dollars. But if the objective is just to evade sanctions, or if the objective is like to have lack of transparency into international trade, then this is going to be short-lived and doesn't have a long-term objective that would make sense for the investors to engage into it.